Thank you. My name's Chris Keulemans. I've been at the Central European Forum for 8-9 times. I am very, very grateful to be back, and I'm very, very grateful that so many people have shown up tonight again. And I ask you for your ovation, because we are joined here now by two of the most sharp and brilliant thinkers in Europe today, because that's what Central European Forum is about. Every time I come, Marta Simečková and Andrea Pukova, who organized this, they come up with themes that are more gloomy, more depressive every time, but I leave here every time with hope. Hope because I meet minds and thinkers like these, hope because of the organization, hope because of the always excellent translators that help us, and hope because you can see that there's so many people in Bratislava who want to spend 17th of November thinking about the future of this country, this society, and of Europe and the world in general. As Michal Havran at the beginning made very clear, these are catastrophic times, and it shows from the theme that we will tackle in this hour. We are going to speak about life between dictatorships. Now, I thought for the last 35 years that democracy is the only model available for Europe, but maybe democracy turns out to be just a happy accident in between dictatorships, in between terror. Maybe the system that we have all built and believe in is just a fluke. Is there a way to transform this system, if you believe in it, into something that is sustainable for the future? And is maybe Europe, a common Europe, a shared Europe, part of that answer? We will speak about this now with the writer and novelist Robert Menasse, and with the financial journalist and analyst Martin Wolf. Both of their important works have been made available in translation in Slovak and or in Czech. So I guess many of you have become familiar with parts of their works. It's so good that you are here. I want to begin with one scene from a movie, No Man's Land, by Danis Tanovic from Bosnia and Herzegovina, 1996. Does that ring a bell?
I certainly haven't seen the movie, I'm afraid.
In that movie, it's wartime, the Bosnian War. There's two young soldiers in the trenches above the city, defending the city from the Serb troops. And one soldier asks the other soldier, do you know the difference between an optimist and a pessimist? And this other soldier, he hasn't heard the word optimist for a long time. So he says, tell me. First soldier goes, a pessimist says things cannot go worse than they are today. And the optimist says, of course they can. So my question to you, I will start with you, Robert Menasse. It's a question to both of you. Are you an optimist or are you a pessimist? We agreed that you would speak, Sie sprechen auf Deutsch, wenn Sie willen, und we have the simultaneous translation. So,
if this is okay for you, I feel more comfortable to answer complex questions in my mother tongue. It is, I guess, the human right of a poet and a writer.
You speak in your mother tongue, and the German, you can follow it on channel number 7. The English you can follow on channel number 6. Go ahead.
Ich habe darauf 2 Antworten. Die eine ist,
I have 2 answers to this.
Optimismus und Pessimismus und Welthaltung wird ja oft
And optimism and pessimism and attitude to life are very often described with this image. Is the glass half full or half empty? And I think that the decisive question is
Flasche, mit der man nachschenken kann.
Whether there is a bottle from which you can fill the glass. And the second answer is
ich momentan auf die Krisen und auf die Probleme und Bedrohungen
my response to crises and threats
reagiere.
which we have here on a global scale.
Ich habe eine große Hoffnung und das ist sozusagen der
And I
Optimismus
have
in mir. Ich
a
habe eine
hope,
große
a big
Hoffnung,
hope, and that
nämlich,
is this
dass
optimism
nicht
in me.
eintritt,
My
was ich
hope is
befürchte.
that what I'm afraid of will never happen.
On the circumstances, if there is more water, then the question of half full, half empty is not relevant. And your last answer was you're an optimist and a pessimist at the same time.
Exactly.
You fear and you hope. Thank you. Martin.
Okay. Well, in terms, first of all, I'm really delighted to be here in this very extraordinary building to celebrate and commemorate a very important event in European history, and which leads to this question pretty naturally, since I have to say between 1989 and 1991, I was more madly optimistic than at any other point in my life. And indeed, I wrote about it at the time as the happiest political events of my life. So the time now is different. That's obvious. In the terms you've set the question, I'm clearly an optimist because things could be much, much, much worse. And obviously the effort is to prevent that. And to explain that, which is also to explain why I wrote in my most recent book, which is called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, which will be translated into Czech, but not, I fear, into Slovak, that I can get at this best by picking up what Robert said about my mother tongue. English is not my mother tongue. My mother's tongue, that is to say, the tongue of my mother, was Dutch. The tongue of my father was German.
Explain.
And they came, I won't go into the history of this, not an unusual story. They managed to escape with their lives, with their immediate families, from Austria and Vienna and from the Netherlands in 1937 and 1940 respectively. And therefore they became British. So I did. And so this is not my mother tongue, but it's certainly my tongue. And that gets to the point, I mean, it's pretty obvious to anybody that if you take the Second World War as your benchmark, and it is a natural benchmark for anyone surely in Europe, then things can indeed get almost infinitely much worse. And our job, and I as a commentator and writer, but I think it's the job of all of us as human beings who are Europeans, and despite being British, I'm very much still a European, to prevent the worst from happening, and we're a very, very long way from that. Still today. There's lots of reason to hope.
It's your personal story makes it such a natural thing for you to be here tonight, I think. But also the work that you have been doing over the past decades. Martin Wolf, some of you might be following him. I'm not an economist, but in policymaker circles, in business circles, in boardrooms, in palaces and in parliaments, his financial analysis in the Financial Times, the world's leading financial newspaper, is being studied almost religiously for a very, very long time now. And The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, very good title for the situation we live in now, is a book where you describe the crisis, but in the end you also describe possible steps forward. And I hope we can get to that later on in the conversation. This book you mention somewhere, let me see. I hope I'm wrong, but it is possible that the emergence of democratic capitalism was accidental, that it was a coincidental result of political and economical development after World War II. Democratic capitalism as a happy accident, exactly what we're asked to talk about today. Do you think this might be a one-time phenomenon in between catastrophe before and catastrophe after?
When I wrote that, I wasn't thinking about it narrowly in terms of catastrophe, though this is how we started. To narrow down my argument to a manageable soundbite, in the way I see this is let's start with the 18th century. In the 18th and 19th century, there emerged out of its predecessor a new economic system, which Karl Marx called capitalism, and Adam Smith would have simply called the market economy. And that generated a completely extraordinary transformation of the human economy and society. And among other things, I argue at length, and I think convincingly, it created enormous pressure for widening the body of citizens and citizenship to people who had been excluded in what had previously, for a long time, I won't go into the details, been aristocratic and monarchic societies based on the power of land ownership, in the true sense, rentier societies. And in a market economic system,
A trhová ekonomika, bohužiaľ je to príliš komplikované, nebudem hovoriť.
Extend the realm of the political. And in a number of societies, that led, over the course of the 19th centuries, to a widening of franchises and something we would call democracy. This was in no way universal, as we know. The German Empire, for example, resisted this very, very effectively, and it was certainly not universally successful. And I'm not even going to talk about the colonies of the West. It's pretty obvious. So it was a really embattled emergence of democracy, but it was there already. It's not just after the war. But it seems to me that the fact that the war was won, in the West at least, by democratic powers of which far and away the most important, crucially from a power point of view, is the United States, that's obvious, with all its problems, led to a settlement, allowed a settlement in Western Europe in which this democratic idea was married to a certain sort of politics which you can broadly describe as social democratic, though I think the German Ordo school can fit into that, allowed for the extension of this democratic idea across the whole continent, and because of its power and effectiveness vis-a-vis the communist revolutionary tradition, also come out of this story, this became worldwide attractive, and particularly after the fall of the Soviet Union because of its failure. So I wouldn't say it was just an accident. It wasn't. It had accidental elements. And those accidental elements have become more obvious in my argument because the economic underpinnings of that post-war settlement in our societies, and even more so in much of the rest of the world, have crumbled or failed to take root. And we are living with the consequences of that, among other things, in core democratic societies, and most significantly in the United States. And that changes everything. So I would say not accidental, but not fated. A choice, not fated, not destined. We weren't destined to end up with democratic capitalism, but it was a perfectly plausible outcome of these historical developments. And because it wasn't destined, we can lose it again. And we can lose it again, and I don't think in the end we will end up with much of a capitalism either. We will just decay. But that's another story. But that's my sense of this historical eventuality. Not accidental, definitely not, but not destined, and there are other fates.
Yeah. So many entrances for more, but I would like to ask you the same question first, Robert Menasse. You spend greatest part of your life in Vienna, in Wien. Do you sometimes think this democracy that I have grown up in, that I've enriched myself, that is just only a blip in between darker times before and after?
Also ich glaube, wenn wir darüber sprechen, dass die Demokratie wieder verloren gehen kann, dass sie bedroht ist.
Democracy, as you have said, may be in jeopardy. And before I go into more detail, I think I need to make clear two things. What are we talking about when we're talking about democracy? What is our understanding of democracy?
Was erwarten Sie sich von Demokratie?
There are public polls in which people are asked, what do they expect from democracy? And there is a large percentage of people who respond, I would like to live in a democratic country, and what I expect from democracy and democratic system, I expect that my well-being and my welfare, my riches will be greater and greater. There is no democratic model in which this would be prescribed. In China, you can also have growth of democracy. And then there is about 20% of responders who claim that they expect social justice, justice in allocation of resources in society. They want to live in safety. They don't want to feel insecure in a country. They don't want to feel fear. They just want to have the security, safety. And you can have the same features in a police regime. So what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about our political reality? We are living in European Union. We are living amongst 26 democratic countries with 26 completely different democratic systems. We have a constitutional monarchy here. We have republics, we have democratic republics, we have countries with majority vote, we have countries with parliamentary elections where everybody has 2 votes or just 1 vote, as it is in Austria, or the voting system that you have in Slovakia. We have voting or election arithmetics based on which we make the calculations. So the situation in Hungary or in Austria would be completely different. So 27 different democratic systems in these member countries. So what is actually a democracy? The only common denominator that we can actually find among all these is that these are national democratic systems. And now let's go over to the crisis of democracy and let's go to the roots of the crisis. We have joined a common democratic union because of the reasons that we can talk about and which are very reasonable. So we have decided we wanted to build or construct a democratic Europe that has learned the lesson from catastrophic wars. But let's not forget a generation that came with the European Union, generation of founders during one human life, went through the French War, First World War, Balkan Wars, Second World War, and then Cold War on top of it.
Ein politisches System finden, mit dem
And
wir Frieden
these
garantieren können.
founders told themselves that they wanted to find a political system which would safeguard peace. The aggressor was nationalism because all the wars were nationalistic wars. So they told themselves, this is what we need to battle against, and let's create a union of nations. And this is how European Union was established. We have common currency, we have Erasmus space that joins universities, we have Schengen space, and so forth. But in an organization of democracy, we are still sustaining the system of national democracies, and the conflict after, in the development, the post-nationalistic development is the crisis of democracy that we are going through right now, and there is only one way out of it. Well, we can only say, okay, nationalist democracies were only a chapter in our history. And right now we are witnessing a situation when our welfare is in jeopardy. And we have different demands on our life. We want to develop democracy in a direction of the post-nationalist democracies. And one more sentence I'd like to add. The crisis is among the nationalist and post-nationalist democracies, and no one has even started to think about this post-nationalist democracy, or what it actually is, how it could look like. And we already see the tendencies to go back to this nationalist democracy, where parliaments are being rid of the EU flags, the legislation that is against EU. Let's just take the UK and Brexit. I would just like to state an example concerning this conflict between post-nationalist and nationalist democracies. I don't know if you are aware of it, but we have a Charter of European Human Rights, which is enshrined in Constitution. You cannot be a member of European Union if you are not following the Charter of Human Rights, and that is a difference between the UN Charter from '76. That one was not binding, but the European Charter of Human Rights is binding, and that is a huge difference. When UK was a part of European Union, United Kingdom did not want to accept this charter and ratify the charter. It was surprising to me, why would they have a problem with the charter? And then it was quite clearly explained to me. United Kingdom
nation of the Commonwealth hat kein Interesse daran, vor den Europäischen Gerichtshof geschleppt zu werden, wegen Kinder- und Sklavenarbeit, die es zum Teil im Commonwealth noch gibt. So. Und da haben wir einen schönen Widerspruch zwischen nationalen
you can still see in Commonwealth countries that there is a child's labor. So among national democracies, national interests, and the efforts of the EU, we should further develop the national democracies.
Martin Wolf.
The technical side of the translation wasn't perfect. I'm sure the translation was perfect, so I didn't hear all of it, but I think I got the thrust. A preliminary point, which is because my book is written by a British citizen, and because my biggest concern, in fact, is about what's happening in the United States, the issue that has been raised is not a focal point of my book. It is actually much more of a focal point of my previous book, which was about the financial crisis, and a large part of it was about the crisis in the Eurozone. Yep. And that is relevant. It's directly relevant because that was the most bitter conflict between, if you like, national politics and national interests and European politics and European interests, which were resolved, to put it bluntly, by the application of national power. Okay? It was resolved essentially on German terms because the Germans had the relevant power. I don't want to go in that in detail because I wrote a whole book about it, but it's important because it, I think, underlines, maybe we look at it differently, the way that the European Union is mixed up, even today, with national power. I have, I'm going to look at this big question in two different ways. The first is from the lens of what I think of as democracy, which is where I think we probably disagree quite strongly, and disagreement is much more important than agreement, because our basic values, I think, are very different. Very similar, sorry. So what is a democracy from my perspective? I define this as a liberal democracy, and I will And that's a necessary condition for my democracy. So what I mean by that is, at the most fundamental level, two things, perhaps three things. The rulers are accountable to, and in some obvious sense, chosen by the ruled. That's a pretty revolutionary idea in human history. And I think that's a necessary condition for having a democracy. And for that to happen, the core aspects of the political process must be independent of the government, because otherwise such a choice cannot be authentically made. So an illiberal democracy, by which one means one without an independent rule of law or independent electoral processes or independent media is a contradiction in terms. That's my second key point. And that's where the overlap with the market occurs in a fundamental way, because the market depends on the rule of law too, and if it works well, it will tend to generate independence in some of those functions. Not perfectly, but that's the second thing. And the third thing, which is a necessary, and this is the point of difference, necessary condition for a democracy, is that the losers accept the outcome of the vote.
Say again.
The losers accept the outcome of the vote as legitimate. This is pretty obvious, but it is not, to put it mildly, universal. In fact, I can point to some examples quite close to home. Now, the question is, under what conditions do people accept that they can legitimately lose and accept the outcome? And my view now is that they have to believe that they share deeply core loyalties and core values. Without that, they will not accept the outcome of the vote. And the reason why the United States is on the verge of ceasing to be a democracy is that that has ceased to be the case, right? That's a pretty big thing. I am not yet convinced, I'm open to conviction, that the citizens of Europe as a whole would accept the outcome of a vote for the government of the Europe if it reduced them, in their perspective, to a permanent minority. The people they identify to being a permanent minority. And that's the fundamental core issue of the legitimacy of a democracy, and it is, in my view, why, as a matter of fact, nationality was a core element and remains a core element in democracy. Not universally. Switzerland is obviously an exception, but I'm not an expert on this in any way, but the splitting of Czechoslovakia is quite an interesting phenomenon in this regard. Now, let me say the final thing. I know this is a bit long, but you can get back. It's so central. At the same time, and I would go beyond Robert, if you look at the world as it is now, and the interest in now, you ask yourself a very simple question. Will we survive as human beings over the next century if we don't create some form of global government? And I don't mean the United Nations. What would be a tolerable global government? Well, it would obviously be a global democracy, not just a democracy of states, a democracy of people, which leads to Robert's question for Europe on a much bigger scale. And my honest answer on these two secondary questions, can we have democracy without a sense of nationhood? Can we generalize democracy to the level of the world? I don't know, but I'm being British, and I've gone through the Brexit campaign and know why it happened, which it got right broadly. I'm pretty skeptical.
Of course. Because this is what the forum is about, yeah? Disagreement on the most sophisticated, civilized way that you can imagine. Go ahead, Robert Menasse.
Also ich glaube, dass wir uns da überhaupt nicht widersprechen. Wir sind einer Meinung, nur
that we are not in contradiction at all. We have the same view, but maybe the formulation is different. What we heard
dass die Nationen überwunden werden müssen, zum Beispiel im Hinblick auf eine Weltregierung.
That we have to overcome these nationalism issues in order to come to a global world. But I think it's utopia, and I'll be happy if we could start with this in Europe now, with this overcoming this nationalism. That would be a great example for the whole of the world. From the utopian point of view, it's necessary. We see the proof is the economic development. I don't understand why companies can be transnational, but democratic systems not. So I believe that there are some small things which need clarification. One of them is this. When we speak about democracies, we must make clear that we talk about the sovereignty of people, not about the sovereignty of nations. The second point is this expectation to accept the results of elections in case the result of the elections is not reflecting my hopes or interests. And it is legitimate only in case, and only then I can accept it, when the election system is a fair system. For instance, if we have a constitutional majority in parliament of less than 30%, which is a situation in Hungary, me as an opposition voter wouldn't be able to accept it. So it has to be a fair system, a just system. And the third point is, and it is linked with what we have said before, and that's, here I would like to mention and quote Hans Kissler, an expert on constitutional issues, and he said once that democracy assumes a shared citizen, and such people won't never be in majority, and therefore democracy is manifested by the protection of citizens, these citizens. So when I accept the election result and the fact that it is not according to my expectation, and I am the one who have lost in the elections, sorry, it was not shared, but educated. So, but I am an educated citizen. I can accept it if I know that there will be no disadvantages resulting for this to me. And that is the base where we can start how a common democracy could look like in Europe. So educated citizen is the one thing. And I won't live long enough to see these developments in Europe. And that is also the justification of the discussion on such issues. It's necessary. For instance, we have common policies in Europe in various areas. In one area, the result of this policy is a common currency, the euro. But the national ministers of finance in Europe and national parliaments prevented to have euro joined by an all-European financial policy. And why this idea couldn't be implemented? Because of national interest, because of budgetary reasons. The national ministers of finance won't give up the budget. They agreed, let's have a common currency that will help the economy. We don't have to have these different conversions, exchange rates, that's okay, but no common financial policy. And what we call crisis in Europe. This crisis is linked with what I have mentioned. We have a common European economic area, but how do we behave in this area? Do we do what we do is what our national interests want? Take the Greek crisis. The Greek national debt was 3% of GDP of Europe, 3% of European GDP. That was the state debt of Greece. In absolute figures, as a debt of small Greek nation is a lot, but for Europe it was nothing. And if I take the national glasses, then I will say Greece will go bankrupt, and with my European spectacles I would say, oh, no problem. California has debt 1,000 times higher than Greece, and nobody there would think of the idea that California should not be a member of the dollar zone anymore. And we are still facing the same problems. So the root of the problem is the fact that we have a common policy, but we protect national interests. We look at it from the point of view of a nation interests. And from a democratic point of view, it is not so. Let's say I'm a Greek and the German Minister of Finance will tell me Greece must save a lot of money in social systems in order to be able to pay its debts. And I will be told this by the German Minister of Finance, Mr. Schäuble, but it has nothing to do with Greece. We have a common market, we have common economy, common currency. However, a person I couldn't vote for, elect, that is a German minister, he will decide about my system of social security or the education system, and that's a crisis of democracy we have to overcome.
If you want to read more about what Robert Menasse sees in the way that Europe and European Union and European Commission functions as a weird kind of safety net for the dangers that we face. Read his books, Die Hauptstadt, the capital. I believe it's available also in Slovak. Is an incredibly adventurous novel about the most boring thing in the world, the European Commission. I don't know how you did it, but it's a page-turner about the most boring thing you can imagine. That works. It's written with a sense of humor, a sense of the absurd, and a sense of love and empathy as well for the people who keep Europe running day by day. More recently, Die Erweiterung, Enlargement, again, a book about Europe and our union, which won the Prix de Livre Européen this year. So these books continue where we get a glimpse of today. You're also a fearless man, I just discovered, because you gave us a lecture on economy in the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, including the Greek situation, with the man next to you who wrote a whole book about that, and he knows everything. You're a fearless man. I would love you to respond to that, Martin Wolf, but we should go to the audience, and I have one final question from me to both of you. I can see in both of you how you cannot resist thinking about the future and about the possibilities, how to build a system, supranational or not, in the future. I admire that in both of you. But right now, we're facing immediate black danger, and I'm not even talking about what's happening in Gaza. I'm not talking about what's happening in Ukraine. You live in a part of Austria now that is under a kind of neo-fascist rule. In the Netherlands, next week we're going to have elections, and it looks like it's going to swerve way to the right in a way we never experienced in our country. The UK, since Brexit, the government at least has been a shambles. This country, the man who tried to create an illiberal democracy here is back. So we're facing black scenarios. We're facing the destruction of the democracy you both were talking about, that you both are still thinking about. How do we deal with that? Martin Wolf.
Well, maybe is also partly a response to what Robert said, the points of really big disagreement. So the way I think about these things is that nationalism is a modern guise. By modern, I mean, well, I won't go back into the history, say 19th century. I follow Ernest Gellner on that, of something much deeper and more profound in humanity, which is that we are a tribal species, an immensely, lethally tribal species. And I believe this cannot be eliminated. It has to be tamed. And that's difficult. And of course, if you have a tribal identity and you're in a democratic environment, that can show itself in extremely unpleasant forms, including, I didn't need to say that in this part of Europe, the election of people who wish to convert their tribal identity into purist dictatorship. And of course, that link between tribalism and the strong leader is a very profound, I would argue, universal one. And I can list it all over the world at the moment. One country after another, they have elected a strong leader to be their tribal chieftain. And it's intimately related to the underlying reality here in the modern world of nationalism. And the question is how you can contain this link, this force. And my answer is, I think, diametrically opposite from Robert's. So that lets me, it's not, but I want to sharpen it. His answer is leap into post-tribal politics. I think, and by the way, this is a point that directly links with his point. I was opposed to the currency union because I argued, and I think he should take the same view, that a necessary condition, I argued this at length in 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, that a necessary condition for a functioning currency union was a fiscal union and a financial union, and that required a political union, and the fact that they couldn't do it was telling one they couldn't do the currency union. And the crisis that happened, I then foresaw, was inevitable. Now, I don't think the leap to a political union when we were in the middle of extreme tribalism is going to work. It won't happen, and it'll blow up. So I feel my approach is we have to calm the tribal passion. And the most important step, I'm not saying that's true here, I don't know, but in Britain and the US, I argue, which are very important, I think the same is true in France and Italy, these are countries I know relatively well, is to make the people feel that the state, the system, is looking after all of them because they feel they have, to a greater or lesser extent, been abandoned by the system and elites who run the system, including European elites, but also national elites. And if we don't recreate the sense that everybody feels we are part of shared citizenship within our democratic national order, and there is someone accountable to us who is looking after us, they will go for sure for the strongman. In the case of the UK, we made a huge mistake with Brexit. We discovered, thank God, that the man who promoted it was a pseudo-strongman and a fraud. We got rid of him, and we're now just poorer. But the political system at the moment looks strangely stable, though completely ineffective. But in other countries, of course, virulent forms of nationalism are on the march. And I think the question to me, and there's a core question, how best do we manage virulent nationalism, which is tribalism running amok? And my sense is we won't do that if we don't first, a necessary condition for doing that is convincing the people at large that their society cares about them, and we have lost that. And the length of my book explains at length why we have lost that.
I will ask you the same question, and at the very beginning, Martin Wolf said things could have been much, much worse, also in this part of the world. Now we're facing the dismantling of democracy as we've been talking about it. So my question to you is also how did you say it, how to manage this tribalism, how to contain this tribalism. You've written, thought, and spoken a lot about how the European Union works, and I think the way the European Union works in all its complexity, in all its intransparency sometimes, is one of the reasons that things have not gone so much worse yet in this part of the world. Do you agree?
First, I want to answer this thesis of the tribe identity. Das ist wirklich lustig. Immer wenn Menschen erklären wollen,
it really is interesting.
Die nationale Identität
Anytime people are trying to explain that national identity is a basic human need,
mit der Begrifflichkeit in die Steinzeit.
They talk about Stone Age. They talk about some tribes in the Stone Age and like common identity in a tribe. And national identity is a human ontological need. And we didn't have them since Neolite, so I don't believe it's in a human nature. I think it's just an organization of humans which was established at some point in a history. In 19th century, that was the peak of the nationalism. Then at the beginning of 20th century, and the nationalism actually brought the Habsburg monarchy into pieces. That's a good example. Habsburg monarchy was a state of many nations. I'm going to say this. Habsburg monarchy had a joint currency, a joint administration, bureaucratic apparatus,
Sie hatte etwas,
law,
was hochinteressant ist von heute aus betrachtet.
Common
sie hatte kein Interesse,
legal
eine
system,
Nation
and
zu
something
werden.
that's quite interesting.
Und sie hatte Nationalisten etwas
It did
entgegengestellt,
not
was heute in
aspire
Vergessenheit
to
geraten
create
ist,
one
nämlich
nation.
das Statut
And
der
against nationalists, it
Personalautonomie.
used
Das
the
Statut der
status of
Personalautonomie
personal
bedeutete,
autonomy.
man konnte
We're
Mitglied
forgetting
einer
this.
Nation sein, wobei Nation damals
It
der
means
Begriff
you could have
für
been a
verschiedene
member
Formen
of a
von
nation.
Identität war.
And at that point, there were various forms of identities in that nation. You didn't claim any rights to an area, to a certain location. They said, whether I am Czech, Hungarian or Slovak,
auf einem bestimmten begrenzten Territorium mein Ungarn haben.
I want to have Hungary on a certain area. But Habsburgs said, no, you can only have personal identity, you can live in the Habsburg monarchy anywhere you want, you can work anywhere you want, you can travel to Vienna, and you will have identical legal system anywhere you go, but you have no right to your own location or territory. That was a revolutionary idea. And nationalists blown it to pieces, and they created their own nations, and it is really interesting. None of the nations that were born from the broken down monarchy
in Freiheit, Sicherheit, Rechtszustand, wachsendem Wohlstand
ever
gelebt
lived in a freedom, legal security, because there was a civil war afterwards,
Terror, Diktaturen und alles Mögliche.
armies,
Und Reichtum,
Stalinist
Wohlstand,
regime,
Sicherheit,
and
Rechtsstaatlichkeit kamen erst wieder
whatever.
zurück, als
But the
diese
freedom
kleinen
and
Nationen
the legal
eingetreten
system,
sind in die
this
nachnationale
only came
Entwicklung der
back when
Europäischen
these
Union.
small
Und jetzt muss man noch
nations
immer erklären,
started
dass
its
das eigentlich der vernünftige Weg
post-nationalist
ist
democratic
und nicht die
development.
Renationalisierung.
And this is the
Es
sensible
hat
way,
einen Anfang gehabt,
not the
Nationalismus hat in der Geschichte einen
renationalization.
Anfang und alles, was in der
So
Geschichte einen
nationalism
Anfang hatte bis jetzt, hat auch
had
ein
a
Ende.
start
Es gibt
in
keinen
the
Grund
history
anzunehmen, dass die Nation
and
das erste
a
Phänomen
certain
in der
end.
Geschichte der
So
Menschheit
there
ist,
is
das kein
no
Ende hat.
a reason
Und
to
wir können auch verstehen,
believe
dass
that
Dinge, die
it will not have an
notwendig sind
end.
und sinnvoll erscheinen im
And
Hinblick
we can
auf
also
die
say that
Organisation
those things
unseres
that
Lebens wie die
seem
Demokratie,
sensible in
dass
terms
auch
of
die
organization of our
einem
life and democracy,
ununterbrochenen historischen Prozess des Wandelns unterworfen ist.
this is also subordinated to the historical process of change. I would like to invite you on a journey through times. We can enter a capsule and go to the ancient Greece, to the cradle of democracy. We say that that's the place where democracy was born. Now let's get off, we meet the founders of the democracy there, and we tell them, we would like to talk about democracy. You are a founder of democracy. Can you imagine a democracy without slaves, but with women? And he would laugh.
Ich kann mir alles Mögliche vorstellen. Ich bin berühmt für meine politische
He would say, I can imagine many things, I can engage my political fantasy, that's why I created democracy, but with women and without slaves.
Es gibt keinen Wandel, es gibt keinen Prozess, es gibt keine Weiterentwicklung in der Geschichte.
He would carry on laughing.
Genau aus diesem Grund werden wir eine nachnationale Demokratie entwickeln und wir werden erleben, dass die Nation, wie alles in der Geschichte seinen Anfang hatte, auch ein Ende hat.
Nationalist democracy, and every nation in the history has a beginning and then an end.
Central European Forum is that we can take a bit of time for these conversations. The bad thing is that the more time you take, the more hunger you get for more thoughts. But I am checking with both the organizer ladies, and they're telling us that we have to continue the program because small tradition will be continued tonight. Honorary Central European will be introduced here in a minute. I didn't even mention that to all of you, but I hope you have been as impressed as I was about these two gentlemen who dare to hope that what they fear will not happen. I know for sure that there's one man who is really sorry that he couldn't listen to you gentlemen. That's, of course, Ludovic Odor, the current acting prime minister of this country, who was going to join us. I think he, as a banker, as a politician, as a man facing a very unpredictable future, I think he would have enjoyed this so much, but he couldn't make it because obviously he has a country to run. But I was so happy that you were here, Martin Wolf, Robert Menasse. Thank you very much.